in which the barista is a world-class musician pulling coffees to pay child support, in which blood stains the cannibal's bibs, in which the text messages of young lovers are all erased with one lightning strike. In which the ragged maps once looked like entrails spilling out of the glove compartments, in which the distance between her breasts and her thighs seems like a lifetime, in which the gas station attendant is your father 40 years ago without the pain of years in his eyes, in which there are flowers outside the firehouse for decades after the explosion, in which one restaurateur is dragged away by the police from another restaurateur's bedroom, in which she quotes whole passages of things you told her years ago. Screaming girl runs to the train car, and you recognize her from another dream. In which the arsonist that is your heart is setting fires all over again, in which you break bread with murderers without acknowledging that they are murderers because they are so well spoken and because they laugh at your jokes, in which you are running away from something in your dream but never leave your desk chair the whole time you are awake, in which Maestro Ennio Morricone is contemplating a length of string and the hills in yellow under the blue sky outside his window. You are quite certain that you could make yourself disappear if it weren't for how much you would miss certain people. In which you walk all over the city and always end up at the same restaurant and sit in the same chair and order the same thing, summer rolls and hollow vegetables with garlic sauce and a Vietnamese beer. In which a woman is crossing and recrossing her legs in time to the stoplight outside the window and nobody seems to notice and nobody calls it a phenomenon. A piano in an upstairs window when it's raining is enough to make you remember the taste of kisses, in which breathe is on your to-do list, in which she takes off her glasses and looks up from her book, and you commit the crime of noticing her taking off her glasses and looking up from her book. In which the body isn't an outline on a sidewalk, but knows it will be one day. In which Ennio Morricone is sitting in the barber's chair and a Sergio Leone movie is playing on the television in the corner, and the barber is whistling along but has no idea whose hair he's cutting, in which nothing is more beautiful than the loneliness of the getaway car after the robbery is botched, and he's still sitting on the curb watching the police lights and deciding when to slowly pull away from the curb. In which dissolve is the only verb left that you use when speaking of yourself. A line of people is walking toward the horizon, and some of them are joining the line without knowing why. And one says, even if we get to the horizon, there will be another one farther out. What then? In which you make out for so long in someone's basement, your tongue hurts and you think your jeans might be worn smooth at the crotch. In which the conductor of this train dreams of becoming an astronaut and is quite sure that his wife is having an affair with his sister. In which the ocean is always the ocean, even if we act as if there is no ocean out there. In which there is an abandoned house just off the highway, and there is a windmill next to the house, and after you climb over the barbed wire fence and walk around the cow patties and step then through what was once the front door of that house, you announce, "Honey, I'm home," and you feel like you are indeed home, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. You ride a bus through Ohio, and the woman next to you in a leg cast and a neck brace falls asleep on your shoulder and kisses and cries into your neck in the night, and you've never met her before, and she is gone just after Pittsburgh, and you wonder still if she was a dream. In which the pilot says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence," and the man next to you says under his breath, "Welcome to the club." In which the father comes home from the war and winces when anything falls or spills. In which the schoolgirl is in love with the soccer player and mentions him first and last in her prayers every night. In which the neighbor cuts his small lawn with a pair of scissors every day and tends a cactus garden of all things in Pennsylvania, of all places. In which there is nothing like the loneliness of seeing your mother's cigarette glow on the porch from a block away and thinking, that's how I can tell where home is. In which I am writing to you now from an undisclosed location and will ask the cleaning lady to have her sister take my letter with her back to Honduras and drop it in the mail from wherever it is she is, as if that will change anything. which sometimes the body is surrounded by thousands of tiny moths, in which the trouble with horses is the same trouble with revenge, and this has something to do with the sudden eruption of stillness into stampede, in which we give names to fragrances as if we can give names to fragrances. In which you own 5 of the same shirt and 5 of the same pair of pants and 1 hat, which you would buy 4 more of if you could find a store that sells it. In which sometimes the body is held by another body, and sometimes the body sleeps next to another body, but in which the body always seems to be alone nevertheless. You never understand architecture until you suddenly understand architecture, in which the drummer closes his eyes and tries to recreate the color of 1974 and his father's car pulling into the driveway. In which it's the birds that are holding up the sky, and not the other way around. In which you have forgotten everything else except how terrified you are, and you are terrified of forgetting everything else. In which houses and highways and parking lots and shopping plazas are being eaten by fire, and you are terrified of being eaten by fire. In which water is rising and you are terrified. In which temperatures are rising and you are terrified. In which your city is sinking and you are terrified of your city sinking. And you are terrified of water rising, and you are terrified that the worst among us are not terrified. In which the worst among us are on the TV and are waving at the cameras and are joking about the air we are supposed to be breathing, and you are terrified. In which the best among us are terrified and you are terrified. In which you are most terrified that the best among us are terrified. The daylight and all the things of the daylight ambush you where you lie, in which the night ransacks what's left of your heart, in which the moon's attempted apologies for what the sun did only end up sounding like excuses, in which you drop your bicycle on her lawn and she comes out of the house and says, "Kiss me," and you kiss her and someone steals the bicycle, and you both take off running after them down the street, screaming and laughing, in which the birds that fly out of the piñata are the same birds you swear flew out of the magician's fist in a different dream, in which it is Easter and all the bells in Paris are ringing and you are running back to your apartment to be there when your parents call and you tell them you were out listening to the bells and not lying next to a woman who would not let you touch her, in which August breaks us into pieces and September says, "It's not my problem." In which the debutante's wedding dress is stained with vomit and the boot prints of those she invited to undress her, in which you go to Spain and proclaim, "Now nobody can say I've never been to Spain." In which the elephants that walk across the Brooklyn Bridge to show everyone who was skeptical and scared that the bridge could hold their weight had no idea that they would appear in 100 years later in dreams about things falling. In which you are homesick for a time when it was still possible to get lost. In which, if we have learned anything, we haven't learned it from this phrase book. In which there are horses running through the sunlight as if we have a choice to not believe in beauty. In which you are dreaming of things falling, and when you wake up, there are things falling. In which a man who looks like he slept in an ashtray paces back and forth in the corner with a smoking briefcase, laughing and shaking his head, and then puts the briefcase down and walks away while it drizzles confetti, even though there is no parade. In which there is a cellist at your breakfast table and she is lovely, and you are 21 and you have no idea how she got there, and then she will disappear a few minutes later. In which you are sleeping, and then you wake up, and there is suddenly Chicago through the windshield. Your father is dying and decides to fall out of an airplane, and you are certain that he will do something to make sure that his chute doesn't open. But it does, and he stands up and starts telling jokes all over again, as if he hasn't just flown through clouds. In which you swim and you swim and you swim, and you still don't know if you really know how to swim. You are terrified of fires, and there are fires, in which you are terrified of melting ice, and there is melting ice, in which the trains are stopped in the tunnels, and you are terrified of trains stopped in tunnels, in which the elevator doors won't open, and you are terrified. You are terrified, and you are terrified of being terrified, in which the worst among us have taken the wheel, and we are in the back seat just trying to watch the landscape before it disappears. Just trying to hold each other's hand before each other's hand disappears. And we are terrified of the worst among us. And they are at the wheel, and their feet are on the pedals, and they are telling us that they are the best among us. And you are terrified of the worst among us. In which the ventriloquist doesn't know what to make his dummies say. In which the ballerina cannot remember how to dance. in which the mariachi band forgot that it was all ending and played on into the darkest of the dark, and you were not terrified for a moment of the dark. In which we all kiss something secretly.